Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Build Canada Live. I'm Lucy Hargreaves, the CEO of Build Canada, and I'm so excited to be joined today by Andrea Mandel-Campbell. She is a veteran business journalist and author of the 2007 bestseller, Why Mexicans Don't Drink Molson. She's also an incredible entrepreneur and recently founded a new adventure travel company, Caribou Adventures. Welcome, Andrea.
Great to be here.
Great. I'm so excited for our conversation. You and I first connected over the summer, and we spoke a lot about your book and how, even though it was written back in 2007 and was a bestseller at the time, so many of the lessons that you shared in that book and the reflections that you shared are still relevant today. So I'm really excited to dive in on that. And for those of our listeners who don't know, you argue in that book that Canada's economic problem is definitely about too much government intervention, but that it goes beyond protectionism and regulations to a lack of global ambition. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit more what you mean by Canada having a lack of confidence, and how is it different to other places you've looked at and experienced in your life?
The short answer is that, we are both a big and a small country, huge piece of real estate with a pretty small population, located beside, the juggernaut that is the United States. And on the one hand, that's really messed with our psyche, I think, as Canadians for a very long time. And maybe unfairly to a degree, giving ourselves a bit of grief when you see the way the world is now bowing to everything that the current US president is demanding. But it kind of shows both the power and kind of the intensity of living beside such a huge behemoth. On the one hand, it's made it very, very easy for us to very, very easy for us to throw things over the border, sell them to the richest economy in the world without too much effort. We've got a lot of resources, just kind of boom, over the border they go. But at the same time, it has kind of had an impact from, I think, at least in older generations, around whether we could actually compete against, such a massive economy and such, big, bold figures in the US that, sometimes can feel pretty intimidating.
Yeah. You, in the book that you wrote, the title of the book is about the Molson story. And I was wondering why that's still relevant today. It was very relevant at the time. Why is it still something that we should be thinking about and caring about today?
Well, the book isn't about the Molson family. Really, it's a metaphor. The whole point is that, and I use Molson as an example, we had all the ingredients to be a global leader in beer, for example, and we still pretend that we are, but we are not. We had in the Molson Brewing Company, we had the oldest brewer in North America. We had all the raw ingredients, right? The fresh water, the barley. Um, and, and and so you would think, that as a brewing country, that we would be one of the countries in the world that had a leading global beer brand. And what's ended up happening is that, in essence, we're the only country that doesn't. And you see, big, huge conglomerates coming out of Europe, Mexico. I mean, why is it that Corona, a substandard beer that, nobody in Mexico actually drinks, has become a leading global beer brand? And it has to do with a number of things, government protectionism being one, the beer store in Ontario being the most making Molson and Ontario the most profitable beer market in the world, because they didn't ever have to learn to distribute or really brand, and made money just far too easily. And as a result, it made no rational sense for them to ever try and really go out and compete globally. And by the time they realized they should, it was already too late. So it's really more a metaphor for kind of the argument that we have everything that it takes, but at the same time, we often miss the boat.
Yeah, we say this a lot at Build Canada, that as a nation, we have all of the ingredients that it takes
Mhm.
to be the most prosperous country in the world. We have the land, the talent, the water, the resources, and it's just about trying to fit these together in the right recipe to get the
Right.
result. And to date, we just haven't been able to figure that piece out.
Yes, well, I've often thought about it. People asked me after I wrote Why Mexicans, please write another book. And the working title was going to be The Unstrategic Country, because we're just, we've never been very strong in terms of thinking strategically about, how to be bold and get out there and actually leverage the resources we have. And part of the problem is we have a little bit, or a lot of different things, and it makes us hard to focus, I think, sometimes.
What inspired you to write this book originally?
I was mad. I'll be honest. I mean, I had spent 10 years as a foreign correspondent in Latin America. I was working for the Financial Times of London. My last job was in Mexico. I was covering NAFTA, free trade. And as a Canadian, proud Canadian, I was always looking to see what Canadian companies were coming down to take advantage of the opening of the liberalization of the markets in Latin America. And I found far too few. And the irony was, so many Latin Americans really would have loved to work with Canadians. And they would constantly ask me, where are you? We don't want to work with the Spaniards because, they colonized us for 300 years. And, the Americans, thank you, but no thank you. So they really would have preferred the Canadian option, but they didn't see us down there. And it was very frustrating. So when I got back to Canada, I started work again as a journalist, and I was really kind of shocked at how sleepy this country was, and how, China had just joined the WTO at the time, and it was very obvious that the winds of change were coming, that trade was not going to be the way it used to be, and things were going to get a lot more challenging. And it seemed like Canadians were on another planet. Government, nobody seemed to realize what the impact of, nobody was thinking about it. Nobody was looking out over the horizon. And yeah, it just made me angry, really. And I just wanted to write, both as a proud Canadian, a wake-up call to say, hey, we really need to be thinking about these things if we want to preserve our way of life and our prosperity.
Yeah, I definitely understand that sentiment, and it feels like in many ways a lot has not changed since 2007.
No, I can't say that much has changed. I mean, I would say, in many ways, a lot of the things that I talk about, that I prescribe, that I say, hey, we've got to get it together, like interprovincial, like obvious things like interprovincial trade barriers. Still talking about it all these years later. We've been talking about it forever, it seems. At the same time, I would say there's a bit of a sea change with the younger generation. I think, there's some super impressive young entrepreneurs. When I wrote that book, that we hadn't really seen the full potential of the tech sector for Canada. And if I had to write it now, I'd be definitely focusing a lot of the book on that. And we didn't have that at the time. It was really still all about natural resources. So I do see a lot of potential there, and some really impressive young entrepreneurs like Michael Katchen, for example, at Wealthsimple, or Dax De Silva at Lightspeed, or there's so many to mention. But I'd say that a lot of the younger gen of entrepreneurs also don't have, I think, some of the insecurities and lack of confidence that the older generation suffers from.
Yeah, you talk in the book about Canadian modesty, and that there's this belief that foreigners won't want Canadian products. And so I'm not sure if that's exactly still true today. It feels like it's still pretty true in many sectors. Like, what should we be focused on to change Canada's culture so that we can kind of get out of our own way and sort of shift that mindset to be more ambitious and less modest and less apologetic about ourselves as a
I'm
country?
personally, I don't know if I think we are less, I think, as I say, that younger generation of people are less apologetic. I don't, I mean, I think, and you see this with what's happening in the world today, and with what's happening in the United States. I actually think there's huge potential for us, in the sense that you can be a grounded, modest, but still confident, smart, sharp country and business owner without, having to go out there and blow the place up. So I personally think that we have a lot of potential. I think, some of the challenges we face is around, the piecemeal nature by which we do things. And the unwillingness to say, okay, we're going to go all in on X, for example. We're always trying to kind of make everyone happy. And, that consensus building is part of what makes Canada Canada. But at the same time, I do think we have to be willing to, choose a lane sometimes and just go for something.
Yeah, it does definitely feel like incrementalism
Oh,
is
yeah.
the way we approach most of our issues in as a nation. And even if you look at sort of provinces and municipalities as well, I don't want to target only the federal
No.
government here, but it just feels like there's this aversion to being bold and decisive and quote unquote risky, but just sort of like taking a bet and making a bet and following through with it.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that is, that is a huge, that incrementalism, and it's unfortunate because I still see it today. I would have thought, there's nothing like a good crisis to kind of shake you awake a little bit. And we started to see, with the new federal government, and let's remember, the federal government is the least powerful of all our levels of government. So we tend to focus on it, but it's actually not the most important one. It is the provinces that really retain a lot of the power here, but they are the most powerful level of government. But at the same time, I do see this increment. We started to see some interesting movement, but I am still seeing a lot of incrementalism happening. Like if I take an example of the new infrastructure projects that the new government has chosen. One being, for example, a high frequency train between Montreal or the corridor, basically Montreal to Toronto. And it took a minute, and I realized they're not talking about a high speed train. They're talking about just more of the same stuff. And it's just shocking to me. Like, go on via, you feel like go anywhere else in the world on a train, and you'll see the difference between riding on a beat train between Montreal and Toronto. It's embarrassing for a country that's a G7 country, right? It's about being incremental and mediocre. Those are examples to me of like things that we need to be much more serious about.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. The book was published in the late 2000s, and since then, I mean, I think most of our listeners will have seen our productivity numbers, and they've pretty much flatlined in the last decade or so. Has
They
anything
were always
changed?
bad. No, they were always bad. The numbers
Has
were always
yeah, has anything changed in your view? Or like, is what we're seeing today just a continuation of the trends that you sort of identified and called out in the late 2000s?
It hasn't changed. Like we've lost a lot of time since I wrote that book, because one of the reasons for writing the book was the flatlining of productivity, which apparently now looks good in hindsight to where we are now. But it is around, things have not changed, and that's because things have not changed. Other than, yes, we've had some great tech entrepreneurs and the like, but it's really around the competitive landscape in Canada, right? What forces productivity, what boosts innovation? It always comes down to the competitive intensity. You have to have the incentive for it. And those things haven't changed. Like, I made a lot of recommendations in my book around like the big oligopolies that kind of are the glue that kind of still kind of gums up the works of a more innovative, productive entrepreneurial economy. And that comes down to, foundationally things like, the banking system, which is so slow and archaic. And I can say as a business owner, just like I actually, and as a former journalist, I'm thinking to myself, my gosh, I should just write an article about like some of the absolutely just last century ways of operating, because the banks don't need to change, because what imperative do they have, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
and so,
let's get
yeah,
into that. Like, I know you
yeah.
made a number of recommendations in your book about how we break out of these patterns. Like, maybe it would be great to just take a few minutes to go through, what it was that you recommended then, and what can we learn from that, and what should we be focused on today?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, what it comes down to unleashing the competitive force and spirit of the Canadian economy, because human beings are rational. It's not that there's anything particularly wrong with Canadians. If you build an economy and, that essentially going back 150 years was all about protecting our nascent infant industries from the US. I mean, the whole template of our economy was the branch plant economy, which was either you're protecting your own nascent industries, or you're creating incentives for others to come in and invest across over the border, and have a branch plant in our country, right? And so what we're now seeing is the retraction of that, i.e. the car industry. The Americans are saying, why do we need a Canadian branch plant? Um, why can't we just bring it back to the States? What's the point of that? So, we're now seeing the weaknesses and the challenges associated with that. So my point was, in the book, it was reducing our reliance on the US, which is hard because, once again, it's a rational choice to make. But it was also about breaking up these old-timey protectionist structures that originally were there to help us build these nascent industries, but have now been more of a tap on our competitive ability. So I'm talking about the banks. I'm talking about the telecommunications, like all the telcos. Those are two, to me, key examples where we need to see more competition. I don't, when I wrote my book, I was talking about allowing in a lot more foreign competition in the banking sector and breaking up a lot of the rules around ownership structures. Now, of course, then we had the financial crisis, and everybody said, oh, the Canadians, they did so much better than the US. But I don't think it's a binary black or white. I think there's something down the middle. Because, as a few friends in the banking industry said to me, it's not that we were, so much better than the Americans. We were just slower. We hadn't gotten there to where because they didn't have the impetus to be more creative with their financial instruments. So, but the banking sector is a big drag on Canadian businesses, and it's just like a very small example. I was talking to my bank, which shall go unnamed at this point, but and they were telling me, if I happen to be traveling in another province and I wanted to do some investing with my company proceeds, they wouldn't be able to do it because I was physically in a different province than where my corporate headquarters are. And for compliance reasons, even though they're a national bank, I'm not allowed to do any kind of transacting if I am actually physically not in the province where the bank account is. And I'm thinking, that this is a distributed world, right?
Yeah.
That people are
It sounds
distributed.
crazy. That sounds crazy.
Crazy. So it's examples like this. And the other thing to me, it's really hitting on a lot of these kind of foundational structures that I think are a real impediment to lowering cost, enhancing competitiveness, and really being more of the oil that helps Canadian companies kind of get more productive, more innovative, and just kind of grease the wheels of business.
Yeah. We've published a few Build Canada memos about these issues related to competitiveness over the last several months. We had one on wireless competition that was sponsored by Bryce Sheshuk. We've written on stable coins, open banking.
Open banking, yeah.
There's just a lot that I think there's a lot of opportunity in those two sectors alone.
Huge.
For not just breaking down sort of monopolistic, outdated practices, but also just like looking at it from a customer service perspective and thinking about how do we just deliver better services for like the customers want at a better price, right? Like the example you just shared on banking is like why, there's such a huge opportunity there for better customer service to get not only individual Canadians, but business owners who, like yourself, who are trying to grow and scale a successful, competitive venture in this country. And like you need support to do that. And you need flexible, banking infrastructure to be able to do that works in a way that you operate, not in the way that people may have operated 50 or 60 years ago.
They're just so slow. I operate an international company. We operate in many jurisdictions, and just getting the bank to understand I need to pay people in other countries it was weeks of work. Like it shouldn't be. I kept saying you must have other clients
like surely I'm not the first one
I
who
surely
has said
am
this.
not the only one. But I mean, and fundamentally, the other thing I would say, because I rather than focusing on particular industry, it's more about the foundational elements that lift all companies, that lift the competitiveness and the productivity and the entrepreneurial ability for Canadians across the board, regardless of where you are. So yes, banking, wireless, and taxes. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're paying over 50% in taxes, where's the incentive? I just don't understand it. And I understand why people would want to leave. And if you're in a small country that's already higher cost, to then have such high taxes, it's counterintuitive to me. It's not competitive. It pushes people out.
On interprovincial trade barriers, you had mentioned it was something that you wrote about back in 2007. We actually just published an interprovincial trade barrier tracker a couple of weeks ago that for the first time, you can go to buildcanada.com and see this tracker for the first time sort of shows all of the trade barriers and the actual progress that is being made on negotiating these barriers and coming to agreements on them. There are 33 trade barriers that exist right now in Canada, and only 11 of them have been agreed across provinces. So we're still only 1/3 of the way there, despite all of the public rhetoric around breaking these down. So, so many of the problems that we've talked about and that you talk about in your book are cultural, but it's still the case that the government should try to be part of the solution. So I'm curious to get your take on, if you were advising, whether it's the current federal government or provincial governments, what are the top 3 policy changes that you would recommend that would have the biggest impact on making Canadian companies more globally competitive?
Yes, I mean, there's actually, the list is long. It was hard. It's something like my wish list is quite long, and frankly, we've touched on all of them, many of them. Lower taxes. It's not acceptable, and you hear some
corporate or personal?
Both. But it's really untenable. And I think that when you have the states so close to you, and it just makes it so much more difficult. We constantly whine and complain about Canadians going over the border because they have a much more attractive environment there. And that includes personal as well as corporate income taxes. Instead, everybody spends their time, and Molson did the same when it came to how they operated. They spend all their time looking for loopholes. Everybody spends all their creative energy looking for loopholes around how they pay about not paying taxes versus actually just having a much better tax system. So I would say number one. The other thing I talked about was banking. And I do believe that we need to really revisit the banking system and see how we can. I mean, Michael Katchen at Wealthsimple's done a great job of in terms of creating, an alternative, some alternative choices. But I'd love to see the system. I'd love to see the embrace of open banking. It's no excuse for how long that's taken, and just I'd love to see some more competition in our market. And the other thing, and I don't know the process for how you do it, but my experience, having worked both in government and being on the business side, is it is like two solitudes. I think it might be a little better than it used to be, but basically you go into government and there are no business people there. There is no business-minded people there. You're dealing with a bureaucracy that is oftentimes business is very arm's length from them. And I would love to see a much tighter integration between business and government. Whereby, I mean, there's some parts of government that are almost hostile to business and certainly don't understand the mechanisms by which business decisions are made. So I would love to see, there's lots about the American system I don't like, but the fact of the matter that you have business people that are heavily integrated into their government, and I think we need more deal makers. We need more deal makers in government, and that is something we do not have.
Looking ahead, what are your predictions for Canada? Where do you see room for optimism? And we'll make this sort of our last question to tie it off here.
Well, I mean, to be very honest, I was kind of hoping to see more with, I'll speak to the new federal government, even though, as I say, the provincial governments are where most of the power lies. But with that said, I'm a little nervous about what I'm seeing now. I feel like we had an opportunity, an excuse to kind of do some bigger, bolder things. I'm not seeing it. I feel like it's incrementalism again. So I am a little concerned that we're going to continue to bump along the way we've always bumped along, because we have a wealth of resources and not a lot of people. So it makes it pretty easy to kind of divvy up the pie. With that said, where my optimism lies is with the newer generation of younger entrepreneurs who, as I say, are not encumbered really by old ways of thinking, about old insecurities, about feeling less than. We're in a much more global world than we were 15 years ago. And they compare themselves to anyone else out there that they're seeing. There's no divisions in that way. The only thing holding them back is, they come up with a great technology, let's say a life science technology. They can't sell it into, the Ontario provincial government, for example. It'll take them, like, they might as well go to the States, and that's what they do, because they're going to get a better hearing. There's going to be bureaucracy there that's going to be a lot more open to trying a new innovation than you're going to find at the provincial level anywhere in Canada. So I'm really encouraged by the new generations. The question is, is Canada going to be the country to, will tax fund their commercialization? Like, will tax fund their whatever research they do? Will tax fund them hiring people? But will Canadians benefit from their technology? Probably not. And will they end up probably going to the US? Probably so.
Well, I'm hopeful that we can turn it around so that we can build more here at home and definitely capitalize on the energy of that young generation. I think that's a great place to end it off here. Thank you so much, Andrea, for your time and for everything that you've done to contribute to the conversation here in Canada.
Well, thanks so much. And I'm here because I do firmly believe we've got to do better. We can do better. There's huge potential in this country. Um, I'm still here, and I've got kids, and I certainly want them to make their lives and their futures in this country. So I think what Build Canada is doing is amazing. So keep up the great work.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care.